The Galactic Council had ruled for so long that time itself seemed to behave differently in their presence. Civilizations had risen, fractured, and vanished beneath that ceiling of living crystal, and the chamber had never once needed to remember them. To the beings gathered there, extinction was not an event. It was a statistic. A line item. Something noted, archived, and forgotten before the next vote was called. They sat in their tied crescents, forms vast and varied, some ancient beyond counting, others engineered for conquest, trade, or dominion. Their voices carried authority that had ended wars with a gesture and erased species with a signature. This was not a place where fear survived. Fear belonged to those who stood before the council, not those who judged. On the agenda that cycle was a minor territorial dispute along the outer trade cordons. A routine matter. A corrective action. When empire had expanded a defensive perimeter. Another had failed to evacuate a dependent settlement in time. The result was already summarized in neutral language, when human colony rendered non-viable. Population loss listed without names. Infrastructure damage reduced to percentages. The words chosen carefully to avoid emotion, as if precision itself absolved responsibility. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, not of concern, but mild impatience. The council had discussed far worse before the first rotation had ended. A few members exchanged amused signals. Humans were mentioned the way one might mention a fragile supplier that had failed to insure its assets properly. Unfortunate, yes. Relevant only insofar as it delayed trade route. Humanity had joined the widened galaxy late. Too late to be feared. Too late to be mythologized. Their biology was unremarkable. Their ships efficient but uninspiring. Their expansion cautious to the point of frustration. They negotiated instead of threatening. They signed accords others ignored. In council records, humans were categorized as cooperative, adaptable, and strategically negligible. So when the human representative rose from his place, it barely registered. No armor gleamed on his body. No honor guard flanked him. He did not project force, psychic pressure, or status markers. He simply stood, hands at his sides, posture straight, eyes steady. A small figure against a chamber built to dwarf stars. The presiding boss acknowledged him out of obligation, not interest. Protocol demanded it. Tradition insisted that even the smallest voice be allowed a moment before being dismissed. The human did not rush to fill the space. He waited until the chamber quieted, until the low hum of power and impatience settled. When he spoke, his voice carried without amplification, not because it was loud, but because it was controlled. You attacked our home. There was no accusation woven into the words. No plea. No trembling anger. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the same precision the council prized so highly. At first, some thought they had misheard. Others assumed more would follow. Threats, perhaps. Appeals to law. Emotional outbursts were expected from younger species when laws finally reached them. But the human said nothing else. He did not elaborate. He did not justify why the word home mattered. The silence that followed was unfamiliar. Not the respectful hush granted to power, but a pause born of misalignment. The council had prepared to dismiss outrage, not to confront something so plainly stated that it could not be argued without exposing its own indifference. The term home did not exist in their legal lexicons. Worlds were asset. Populations were variables. Homes were irrelevant to governance on a galactic scale. A few council members shifted, irritation creeping in. Others prepared rehearsed responses about jurisdiction and necessity. Yet none spoke immediately, because something about the human's tone unsettled the rhythm of the chamber. He had not begged for mercy. He had not demanded punishment. He had not threatened retaliation. He had simply named what had been done. And for the first time in centuries, the Galactic Council found itself unsure which script to follow next. The silence did not last long. It never did in that chamber. Authority disliked pauses it did not control. One of the Elden delegates answered first, was smooth with practiced condescension, explaining jurisdictional necessity and strategic imperatives. Burdens shifted. Assets were lost. Such events, they reminded the human, were unfortunate but lawful. Others followed, layering precedent upon precedent, drowning the word home beneath centuries of rulings that had justified far greater erasures. They spoke as teachers correcting a naive student. Humanity, they said, was still learning how the galaxy functioned. Emotion could not be allowed to interfere with stability. Loss was the price of participation. Acceptance was maturity. The human listened without interruption. His expression did not harden. His breathing remained steady. When the council finished reassuring itself of its own reasonableness, he spoke again, not louder, not faster, but with a clarity that made dismissal difficult. You mistake restraint for ignorance, he said. A ripple of mild irritation passed through the chamber. The council was accustomed to defiance framed as passion. This was different. There was no heat in his words, only certainty. He did not begin with fleets or weapons. He did not recite grievances. He spoke of origin. Of a world that tried relentlessly to kill its inhabitants. A planet of shifting plates, violent storms, predatory life, and diseases that adapted as quickly as their host. Humanity, he explained, had not inherited safety. It had earned survival through failure, repetition, and stubborn refusal to vanish. They learned to rebuild cities after oceans swallowed them. They learned to cooperate after nearly destroying themselves in wars that scarred their world and their memory. Every time they stood on the brink of extinction, they adapted. They changed how they fought, how they governed, how they valued life. Not because they were gentle by nature, but because experience had taught them the true cost of unchecked destruction. Several council members exchanged glances. Species histories were often recited as justification for dominance. This sounded like something else. The human continued. When humanity reached the stars, it did not do so in triumph. It did so cautiously. It remembered how easy it was to lose everything. That memory shaped their choices. They built redundancies. They prioritized evacuation protocols. They argued endlessly before committing to force. They chose treaties because they understood what total war extracted in return. Peace, he said, was not their default state. It was a discipline. When enforced daily against instincts forged on a dangerous world. The council attempted to interrupt. He did not stop speaking. You saw our compliance, he said, and assumed incapacity. You saw our patience and called it fear. His gaze moved across the chamber, not accusatory, simply inclusive. He was not addressing one empire. He was addressing a pattern. Humanity had lost a home before, long before the stars. They had learned then that unanswered destruction taught aggressors the wrong lesson. So they learned to respond carefully. Deliberately. Permanently. Not in anger, but in ways that ensured the same loss could not be repeated. This time, when the council was silent, it was not confusion that held them. It was recalculation. The human concluded without flourish. We did not come here to argue legality, he said. We came to correct an assumption. No threats followed. No demands were issued. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The council had expected grief or outrage. What it received instead was context. And context, they realized too late, was far more dangerous than fury. The council evaluated species the way it evaluated weapons, by output, by scale, by spectacle. Biological advantages were cataloged. Fleet tonnage compared. Territorial reach mapped and by those measures, humanity remained unimpressive. Their ships were modular, not monstrous. Their physiology average. Their burdens modest. Nothing about them suggested inevitability. The human seemed to understand this flow without it being named. You measure strength by what announces itself, he said quietly. We measure it by what endures. A few delegates bristled. Endurance was not a metric that won wars quickly. It did not carve empires overnight. It did not inspire fear. And yet, as the human continued, it became clear that endurance was precisely what had allowed his species to survive forces that should have erased them long before they reached the stars. He spoke of logistics before he spoke of weapons. Of supply chains that assumed failure as a certainty. Of systems designed to function while damaged, isolated, or abandoned. Humanity did not build for ideal conditions. It built for collapse. Every structure assumed it would be tested, and every plan assumed it would break. Survival lay not in preventing failure, but in continuing despite it. Then he spoke of coordination. Humanity fractured constantly, he admitted. They argued, competed, disagreed violently. But when faced with existential loss, those divisions narrowed with frightening speed. Information flowed freely. Resources shifted without negotiation. What appeared chaotic from the outside concealed a brutal efficiency when stakes became absolute. The council listened now. Not because they feared him, but because patterns were forming that their models had never accounted for. He spoke next of loss. Not abstract casualty figures, but the way humans internalized absence. A destroyed colony was not a strategic inconvenience. It was a wound carried collectively. Names remembered. Places mourned. That memory did not fade with distance. It sharpened. The colony that had been erased, he explained, was not a fortress. It had no strategic value worth recording. It was built by families who believed treaties mattered. Engineers who trusted council assurances. Children who learned the constellations of a foreign sky and called it home without hesitation. When that world went dark, humanity did not answer with fire. They evacuated survivors. They sealed data archives. They reassigned fleets without announcement. Manufacturing queues shifted. Training protocols changed. No declarations were issued. No accusations broadcast. The galaxy mistook the absence of noise for acceptance. That was your final error, the human said. He explained that humanity did not respond quickly because speed invited mistake. Their history had taught them that rage burned resources faster than enemies ever could. Instead, they responded thoroughly. Quietly. In ways that removed future threats rather than satisfying present anger. When Delegate asked, finally, what form that response would take, the human met the question without hesitation. That depends on how many of you choose to pretend this was insignificant. The chamber cooled perceptibly. Not through temperature, but through awareness. This was not a species promising retaliation. This was a species describing a process already in motion, when that did not require permission or applause. We do not escalate for effect, he added. We escalate to conclusion. Silence followed again, heavier than before. The council understood now that humanity's greatest strength had never been hidden behind weapons or numbers. It had been hidden behind patience. And patience, once exhausted, did not produce chaos. It produced resolution. No one spoke after that. Not because protocol demanded silence, but because every response the council had prepared now felt dangerously insufficient. Legal frameworks seemed thin. Authority felt bitter. The human had not challenged their power directly, yet he had placed something heavier than accusation before them, consequence. He continued, unprompted, because this was not a negotiation and never had been. Humanity, he explained, was not seeking retribution dressed as justice. Revenge was inefficient. It consumed attention and offered nothing durable in return. What they required was acknowledgement of harm and assurance that it could not be repeated. You believe this chamber decides outcomes, he said. It does not. It recognizes them. That statement incited even the eldest among them. Recognition was supposed to flow downward. From the council to the galaxy. Not the reverse. He outlined what had already begun without revealing operational specifics. Trade routes quietly rerouted. Cooperative research suspended. Shared intelligence throttled to silence. Defensive accords rewritten with careful language that excluded certain signatures. No declarations. No sanctions announced with fanfare. Just absence, spreading outward like a vacuum. Human allies had not been coerced. They had been informed. Presented with data. Offered timelines. Given choices. Many had chosen to step back from council influence without explanation, citing internal reassessment. The web of convenience the council relied upon was thinning, strand by unnoticed strand. The human did not frame this as punishment. He framed it as adaptation. Humanity adjusted environments that proved hostile. That principle had not changed simply because the environment was political. Several council members attempted to interject, to demand clarification, to reassert authority. He allowed one interruption, only when. You underestimate the cost of unity, the boss said sharply. The human nodded once. We learned its cost long before spaceflight, he replied. That is why we value it. He spoke then of deterrence, not as a threat but as a lesson written repeatedly in human history. Deterrence did not rely on displays of power. It relied on credibility. On the certainty that certain lines, once crossed, altered the future irreversibly. Humanity did not announce those lines loudly. It enforced them consistently. The chamber had grown unnaturally still. Not the ceremonial stillness of reverence, but the quiet of minds recalculating risk in real time. The council understood domination. It understood rebellion. It did not understand a species that refused both and still reshaped the field. You destroyed a place we intended to grow old, the human said, his voice unchanged. You mistook our silence for acceptance. You were wrong. There was no rage in the word. That absence was more unsettling than any outburst could have been. Rage burned out. This did not. He finished with what sounded almost like an observation. Humanity would continue to trade, to negotiate, to cooperate. But it would no longer assume good faith where it had been disproven. Trust, once broken, would be replaced with safeguards. Safeguards scaled well. When he fell silent, the chamber did not rush to reclaim control. No verdict was issued. No rebuttal formed. The Galactic Council, arbiters of countless extinctions, found itself confronting a realization it could not vote away. They had not angered humanity. They had alerted it. And that awareness settled over them like gravity, inescapable and absolute. The galaxy adjusted quietly. There were no declarations announcing a new Eordan, no proclamations carved into archives, no celebrations marking victory or defeat. Change arrived the way gravity did, and noticed until resistance became impossible. Trade flows shifted first, subtle enough to be dismissed as market correction. Shipping lanes once optimized through council space began favoring alternate route. Human systems became hubs of reliability, not dominance, simply places where agreements were honored without revision. Reparations followed without being named as such. Reconstruction materials appeared at the edges of human territory, offered by intermediaries who avoided formal attribution. Beordens were reconsidered and done the language of stability. The empire responsible for the attack found itself increasingly alone, not sanctioned, merely excluded from conversations that now mattered. Influence drained faster than fleets ever could. Humanity did not announce success. It returned to building. Colonies resumed expansion with reinforced protocols. Evacuation frameworks became mandatory across shared project. Defense initiatives were iterated quietly, not to threaten, but to ensure that no human world would ever again be classified as expendable. Other species took note. Some adopted similar standards. Others requested partnership, seeking proximity not to power, but to predictability. Within the Council, classifications were revised. Humanity was no longer listed as emerging or compliant. New terminology appeared in restricted records, careful and unstated. Strategically consequential. To antagonize. Unified and then pressure. These were not accolades. They were warnings written for future readings. The human diplomat returned home without ceremony. He declined honors. Declined elevation. His role, he insisted, had never been symbolic. He had spoken because someone needed to state what had been done plainly, without rhetoric or threat. History would remember him not as a conqueror, but as a reference point, the moment the galaxy learned to listen differently. Children born years later would study the incident without spectacle. They would read how a civilization survived not by striking first, but by refusing to forget. How patience, when paired with resolve, reshaped systems built to exploit indifference. How silence, when chosen deliberately, carried more weight than fury ever could. Among the stars, a rule took form without ever being voted upon. Human settlements were awarded as target. Not because of fear of reprisal alone, but because attacking them changed the attacker. It triggered responses that did not end cleanly. Outcomes that extended beyond battlefields into economies, alliances, and legitimacy. Humanity did not rise above the galaxy. It did not seek dominion. It remained what it had always been, adaptive, persistent, and willing to surrender the meaning of home. That meaning, once dismissed as sentimental, had proven structural. It bound individuals into a whole that could absorb loss without fracturing. Long after the Council resumed its deliberations, after new disputes replaced old ones, the memory remained. Not of a threat shouted across a chamber, but of a statement delivered calmly, impossible to argue away. You attacked our home. The galaxy learned then that some words did not fade. They settled. They endured. And when spoken by humans, they changed what followed forever.